Good afternoon. Welcome to the Inaugural Pedagogy series here at FMA. Just a brief introduction. I'm Jacqueline Garner. The FMA board has encouraged us to promote teaching and good teaching. This series has been done in conjunction with the econometric series that FMA started back in 2008. So every year we do sessions on econometric techniques. We've been doing that for almost 10 years. This is the 9th year that we've been doing that. So we wanted, as an organization, to also start a series on teaching, because many of you, all of us, we all have to teach, and it's always good to get tips on teaching. So I invited 3 of some of the finest researchers as well as teachers in our profession to give us tips on teaching. John Graham from Duke University, Ajay Patel from Wake Forest, and Mihir Dasai from Harvard. We're in the Harvard room, it's appropriate. And Mihir is on his way over. So we're going to kick it off with John Graham, and we'll moderate this. They'll go a few minutes, questions. We'll have time for questions both at the end of every talk as well as at the end of the session. So John?
Well, thank you for inviting me here. Thanks for coming, everyone. My talk's going to be a little bit kind of high level, and then I think Ajay is going to get a little more detailed, and who knows what Mihir is going to do, or if he's even going to show up. But I really love teaching, and I hope you do too, or at least you can tap into that somehow, because it makes the whole process a lot more enjoyable. But teaching is important, right? I think you probably wouldn't be in the room if you didn't agree. But as much as we love our research, the truth is we're going to teach thousands of students over our careers, thousands upon thousands. We might end up influencing more people through our teaching than our research. And so doing a good job of it, I think, is important. Finance is very important, right? People need to know the basic skills of finance, and we're the ones to teach that to them. And in fact, many students are afraid of anything quant, or finance in particular. And so if we can actually connect with them and teach them some of the basics and fundamental intuitions of finance, I think we can do them a lot of good. I think teaching can be a lot of fun. If you really get a good class planned out that you really enjoy, it can be, it tires you out, but I think it can be rewarding, very rewarding and fun. I think we're very fortunate to be professors. It's kind of, in today's world, an amazing job to have. And let's face it, teaching is an important part of the job, and I think we have an obligation to focus on that and do a quality job when we're in the classroom. If you're a new teacher, if you're just getting started, what I've found myself and observed over the years is if you can get yourself over that hurdle early on, then the years that follow don't have to be so painful. But if you fall short of the hurdle early on, the pain it takes to get up above, partially because of a reputation you might develop with the students and what they expect when they come in the room, etc., can be harder. So try to nail it early if you can, and then it's not that you can coast, but then I think it makes the ensuing years easier. So what's going to follow are really just some experiences I've had teaching corporate finance type courses. What I'm going to say may or may not work for you, may or may not work in a non-corporate class, but I'll just tell you my experiences as a corporate teacher. You each have your own style, and you have to obviously find what works for you. Having said all this about teaching, and I'm going to primarily talk about teaching, obviously research is important too. Now the weight between teaching and research varies by school, but teaching well I think takes a lot of time, and so you have to make your own trade-offs and decision there between teaching and research. Good teaching alone I think rarely gets you tenure, so don't just disappear into your teaching at the expense completely of your research. All right, so just a few main points I want to make with a lot of little sub-bullets. The first one is motivate the students so they want to learn the material. And ultimately, that's just about, for my experience, is just convincing them that it matters in their personal lives or in their professional lives, okay? So how do we do that? Well, one thing you might be surprised, I use a lot of survey evidence in class, and I don't save it for the very end of class to say, okay, 2 hours of whatever. Now, what do companies actually do? I actually start with the survey evidence and say, hey, we're going to talk today how companies make investment decisions. What do they do? Oh, look, by this survey, discounted cash flow is really popular. Maybe we should spend this class period really learning discounted cash flow because you're going to need to know that if you go work in a corporation. You can see a financial review article I wrote a few years ago where I kind of talk about that in more detail. But tying it to the real world, I think, is a help. Throughout the course, I'm going to pepper in job interview questions, internship questions, or actual real experiences that students wrote back and said, hey, I just had this experience at work, help me figure this out. What I'll do in class is I'll sort of pose the question to the class, and I'll say, hey, this alum said she was working on this project, blah, blah, blah. How would you figure that out? Oh, guess what? That's what we're studying today. And it'll motivate them to think, that they would need to learn that. So for example, one alum wrote back and she went to work for Campbell's Soup, and they needed to figure out, her job was to figure out whether to package the soup in a different way. It's just a DCF, okay? A cost up front and benefits down the road. And when you explain it that way, then the marketing students want to understand the finance tool also. Current events, here's another job interview. These are some job interview questions that our students have gotten. Is debt cheaper than equity? Shouldn't you just use a lot of debt because the interest rate's lower than the implicit cost of equity? Well, we all know all about that, right? But when you put it up there as, this is a question you might encounter when you're trying to interview for a job with this investment bank or corporation, then the student wants to learn the concept, and guess what? It just set me up to teach levering, how the cost of equity gets levered up as you use more debt, et cetera, all right? Here's another one. Draw me a WACC curve, weighted average cost of capital curve. That's a job interview question that a student should be able to answer very easily. I mentioned that at the beginning of class. I just set myself up to talk about optimal capital structure for the next 2 hours, okay? So by convincing them this is stuff you need to know on the job, or even to get the job, that I find very motivating to the student. Current events, JP Morgan, Mark Zenner, this group puts out this thing, 10 things a CFO should know. You know what? 7 of those 10 things are things we talk about in our corporate finance class. And so if a CFO should know it, we should know it. And you can put that up, and it's sort of affirming to the students to see, oh, these are things CFOs know. I guess they're things we should know. So again, all of these I'm just giving examples of way I'm trying to motivate the students to convince them this is important stuff for them to learn. In their personal lives, I show that, have them do a retirement plan in the first or second class period, or second class period. And that's just really an application of annuity formulas and growing annuity formulas, et cetera. But one, it's eye-opening, and it's probably a good exercise for them to do, and it is finance. But secondly, it convinces them I really need to be familiar with and understand these formulas. I get the picture now. And then finally, even on the quizzes and the assignments outside of classroom time, I try to make it, often something that's a bit applied to some alumni came back with, to make even that exam a learning experience for them. But ultimately, so they see how finance works in the real world. Okay. Intuition is obviously really important. And I try to accomplish that through examples in some sense, but let me just give you an example here. So we'll write up value equals debt plus equity, okay? Well, when a lot of people see that, they think, wait a minute, debt is bad. And debt is something we have to pay somebody else. How can that be increasing value? So my simple little example, I say this is the value of your house, the market value of your house. This is your mortgage, and this is your home equity line, right? Or not your home equity line, the home equity, the equity you've built up in your house. If you know the mortgage amount and the amount of equity you've built up in your house, of course that equals the market value, okay? But once they hear that, they understand how to think about the debt within that component, just by, again, using an example that ties it to something they're familiar with. And by the way, it kind of sets you up to talk about Modigliani and Miller, because it doesn't really matter how big the mortgage is when you're talking about the market value of the house, okay? So again, I'm always trying to get it in their terms. Once you get them hooked on their terms, then you can really pull them along with more aggressive, complicated things. There's a book I read this summer on quantum mechanics that this guy takes incredibly complicated material and simplifies it down into layman's terms, mostly about intuition, okay? And when you read that book, I want to learn more about physics now, right? I understand how important this is, and if I'd read that book when I was 18, I might have majored in physics in college type of thing. It's that good. That's what I hope we can do in finance too, is pull the person in with these basic intuitions and the importance of the material. When I say keep it simple, Look, we could go talk for hours on end, and we're fortunate that people can remember one or two ideas out of the class. Whatever those ideas are, make sure you've stripped them down and explained them as simply as you can, not dumbing it down, but getting that core idea across so you can build upon it. And if they remember the core idea, then some of the other stuff, they might not remember every detail, but they'll be able to come back to it more easily. All right. First thing was motivate the students. Second is engage the students. This kind of overlaps here a little bit, but try to engage them so they're interested on their own terms. So I won't read those because we kind of already talked about those. Guest speakers can be a very engaging process with students. If you get a guest speaker that comes in and they affirm what you've been saying in class, I mean, the student, oh wow, the professor's not just making this up, this was relevant. Now to accomplish that, you might have to work at it a little bit. I don't want a guest speaker coming in and just doing their stump speech, you know. I want them coming in and talking about material that overlaps what we did in class. So I'm going to give Scott Smart at Indiana credit for what I'll say next, because he suggested this to me originally. So we'll get a company come in to talk about their weighted average cost of capital. Now the part Scott suggested is I assign the students, okay, your assignment is go figure out what the weighted average cost of capital is for GM, and one of the groups, I'm going to pick a group and have them present their analysis in front of the GM, assistant CFO guy when he comes in, all right? That really gets them tuned in, really gets them working. They actually, MBA types at least, love this opportunity to talk. And when the guest speaker gets up, they've already kind of gone through a lot of the nuts and bolts, and they can really get a lot out of the speaker. So it's not just having a guest speaker to come in and take up an hour, it's coming up with an exercise that gets the student like fully engaged in the process. That's all I'll say on that. Interactive class, of course, that's always good. I think Mihir will probably talk about case studies, so I'm not going to per se talk about that. In a lecture format, I'm not a cold calling kind of person. Maybe you are, and I've seen some people that works brilliantly for. I do something, this is sort of my soft version of cold calling, is I'll do this throughout the term. I'll pit, say for example, the right half of the room against the left half of the room. We'll go over a subject either later that day or the beginning of the next class. I'll come up with a little review game question. Can two companies that have the same, different return on assets have the same return on equity or something like this? Kind of make them think a little bit. And I'll say, okay, you can talk for 1 minute and then you have to tell the class your answer. And then they get a point or two, and then I go over to that for another question later. And so it kind of is this cumulative thing of getting the students kind of playing a finance game, if you will. But it's all about reviewing the material and forcing them to repeat it back and speak it out loud, which that's harder to do than you think. And as an instructor, it can be kind of disappointing sometimes because you realize, oh my goodness, I thought I taught that, and they have no clue how to answer that question, okay? So it's feedback for you too, but it's engaging to the students. Third thing is connecting with the students, all right? So teaching isn't just about reciting information, all right? I'm going to come back to that because I'm going to skip down right here to something about teaching evaluations, then I'll go back. One of the very first teaching evaluations I ever got when I went to the University of Utah, I had 3 words on it. Teach, don't lecture. And I read that, I was like, what does that mean? And then I thought about it, and what I was doing was just blah, 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 had all kinds of, a fire hose of information coming out, but I wasn't really teaching it, okay? And coming back up here, to me, teaching is about connecting that information to the person in the audience, right? And so that's our objective. And to do that, you have to know where that person is right now. So you have to actually work at that a little bit. I mean, experience helps quite a lot on that. But sometimes it's, understand what the students know and what they don't know. And what you learn over the years is they know a lot less than you thought or hoped they would. I don't mean this to say dumb it down to their level as much as know where they are so you can pull them along, start it and pull them along with you. So anyway, making it accessible to the person you're teaching is, to me, probably the crucial thing out of, the thing that's most relevant to me out of all the things that I'll probably say today. Knowing students' names or where they worked or their job experiences, that can help too. That can take a little work. I don't go out and memorize everybody's name before the first class. I know some people do that to great effect. But I do have a seating chart, which I don't know, sounds like middle school, but at least for me, if I get everybody to sit in the same seats, I can learn their names just naturally, because I always know Jacqueline sitting there, and she raised her hand a couple times, and I just automatically end up knowing her name. It can matter to the student. It's kind of like when you go to your doctor and they actually remember you a little bit, or at least they bluff like they do remember you a little bit. It relaxes you, your blood pressure, your white cuff syndrome goes down or whatever, okay? If they feel a little more comfortable. When I was at the University of Utah, I was teaching, a big state university. A senior came into my office one day and I knew his name. And he said, "You are the first professor who ever knew my name." I was like, "Are you kidding me? That's how easy it is to get a brownie point with a student? It's just by knowing a name?" So anyway, I don't want to oversell that. It's probably secondary, but it can help if you can work that in. Okay, what about teaching evaluation? I read them every year, okay? Right here is my summary for my teaching evaluations from last year. I mean, the teaching evaluations go on, but I summarize them and categorize them, go back and underline the things that I think, yeah, that's a good idea. I know some professors are like, I don't bother with them, they're stupid, whatever, but if we teach companies to do continuous improvement, how do we do it if we don't actually consider the feedback? Now, granted, you're not going to do everything that's in there. You're going to, just like a referee report on your paper, you're going to think, what can I take out of this to help me teach better? And I don't know how you're going to find that out without reading your teaching evaluations. Try to identify and monitor the weaker students. Not to teach the class to them, but to be aware of who they are. Because it's kind of weird. If you get a collection of weaker students, they can kind of deaden that part of the room. And just kind of being aware of that, I think, can help. Sometimes just not to look and call them out with it, but just know to say a couple extra sentences can help pull them along. Now, how to identify them? I'll go to the next slide. And I'm kind of going to skip down here for just a second. With help sessions, right, you can do that with TAs or you can do them yourself. I like to try to do them myself. That the weak students are the ones that show up. That's how I learn where they are and what it is. And over the years, some of the probably the most valuable things I've learned about teaching has been in those help sessions, hearing those students. I thought I explained it well, and apparently I didn't. And you can figure out a way to teach it that the weaker student as well as the stronger student both can understand it. Okay, back up to the top here. Put a lot of care and preparation into your teaching. Teach with energy and enthusiasm. These things here, that can either be positively contagious or negatively contagious, as it might be. The students pick up on this vibe of what you've done on this dimension, and it can be a great thing, and they work harder for you. Or if you're not careful, well, he doesn't care, why do I care, kind of attitude. I encourage you to be quite organized, with your whole teaching plan and everything. Students really like to know what the expectations are of them, what their assignments are, what they need to do and when. I mean, that seems all obvious, but just make sure you're doing that. And if you have to make a change, which happens sometimes, communicate that clearly, right? Where you could get in trouble is if a group comes in, oh, we can't turn it in. Is it okay if we turn it in a day late? Yeah, okay, that's fine. Just send it to me a day late. Then some other group finds out, you let them do it, you didn't let it. If you're going to make a change, make it class-wide and let everybody know, and if it's possible, explain why. What about connecting to research? Here, be a little careful, I think. So for some reason, we have a harder time speaking our own research, I think, sometimes to the business school student level. Somehow we can do somebody else's research better. So be very disciplined on that, but if you can do it, then I think it can be positive. Here's the way I teach capital structure. There's a marginal tax benefit to debt that declines as you use more debt. There's a marginal cost to debt that increases as you use more debt. The optimal amount of debt should be the intersection. This is like Econ 101, right? But so happens, I've done research talking about this, and I actually explain it to the students and even have them do an exercise to try to calculate this declining marginal tax benefit. The marginal cost curve, I can talk about some research I did that estimated marginal cost curves, okay? And if it works, because I have to do a job of explaining it to an MBA or some business student, not a PhD student, it can be a great organizing principle for at least that block of material. But again, be careful on this because there's been other times where I kind of shot it over their heads and it didn't connect. So be careful on that. Help sessions I already talked about. Okay, look, I don't know if you have kids or how old they are. So I've had a couple kids go through college and they'll complain about some teacher, And when I hear the stories, I think, doesn't sound like this teacher really cared. I mean, I'm saying this to myself. It doesn't sound like this teacher really prepared much. So when you're the one shelling out tens of thousands of dollars for your kid to go to school and the teacher's not delivering on the other end, it's a huge disappointment. So teach those kids you're teaching the way you would want them to teach your kid or your relative or whoever it might be, All right, I think this is the last slide. This scene makes sense, know the material well. Obviously the content, you've got to know it really well. I actually do, I named it here, I made up this name for this, section 0, where that I made up, this part I didn't make up. I literally, almost every class I've ever taught, I'm teaching 23, 24 years now, I practice it out loud in my office before I go into the first class. Because only by doing that can I kind of get the kinks out and sometimes remember, oh yeah, that's right, I wanted to change this part and I forgot to change it, so I better change it now. But to get the transitions down, etc. When I've at times observed some other folks teach, that for some reason section 2 is always a lot better than section 1. Well, it's because they basically work the kinks out in section 1. So if you want to work the kinks out in your office by yourself in section 0, doing it by yourself, then section 1 you can really nail it. I don't know if you saw Seinfeld in the Wall Street Journal the other day talking about how he writes a joke and how much time he spends to write one joke, okay? He said he wants to know every letter of every word, every inflection, the exact timing. He'll spend an hour to eliminate one syllable from a punchline because he wants that punchline to hit just right. Now, I'm not suggesting we're going to do it quite that extreme, not every syllable, we're not going to worry about that. But the same effort to the craft of teaching that he gives to the craft of making and delivering a joke, I think it's worth it, right? Timing, this is just a couple random comments here at the end. If you're a brand new teacher, it's great if you can start with somebody else's materials, but don't get up there teaching a slide that you're like, I don't really know why this slide is in here, but this person had it in there. Because that's the one the student's going to ask you about, and you're going to look foolish. But mostly start with somebody else's material, or watch them on video or watch them in person if you can. Then start making changes. Ultimately, you have to own it. Sometimes you see somebody who's still teaching somebody else's class 4 and 5 years later, and it's never quite working. It's got to be your material. And then I'll close with this. I often try to think about like the amount of learning a student can do over hours of work ratio. My objective is not to minimize that, hours of work, but it might be to try to maximize, or at least think about getting a high number on that ratio. In other words, there's some things that we can do that are pretty time consuming that they don't get that much out of. And there's other things we can do that they can actually, I think, learn more, or if we're clever about it, we can help them learn more with a modest amount of work. And so, anyway, I just try to think about that as delivery. So, that's it. Do you want to do questions now?
Let's do questions. We can do questions in between and save some for the end. So does anyone have any questions for John? Now's your opportunity. Yes.
You talked about communication. And my question is, do you have any secrets for getting students to look at the communications you send them? They don't read the syllabus, they don't read the emails, and then they come back to you with the same questions that you try to.
Yeah, well, this is a middle school trick. But I put on the first, and I tell them I'm going to do this. I put on the first quiz a question that they can give. They have to be on. I'm counting on the honor code here. Did you go to the online syllabus and check these boxes like I told you to? Yes or no, plus or minus points. At least they might scramble to do it at that moment. But I hear what you're. So anyway, yeah, that's one weird little trick I've tried. Seems to help a little bit, but it is difficult in today's world to get young people to kind of read our communications. I don't know. I'm not sure I have a great solution on that one.
Obviously, I can't monitor every piece of communication, but I'm going to talk a little bit about an online platform that we use. I can actually go into the statistics on the platform, and I know exactly which students have opened how many files and when exactly they've opened it. So I send my content out over a week before classes actually start, and the day before classes start, I will monitor to see was there anybody that didn't open that file, and because they're supposed to be ready in class, having watched a couple of videos and read a couple of articles, and I can tell exactly who hasn't opened the content.
Any other questions for Ajay?
Any other questions? So I just want to make a comment. This summer, I teach a class every summer in Philadelphia, and it's through another organization. It's through the American Bankers Association. And I did something in class that reminded one of the students of their former MBA professor, who was John Graham. So in the break, you know, he said something. He goes, "Do you know John Graham?" And I said, "I do." And so he told me, so I want you to talk about this. He said, "I went in his office one day." And he goes, "He's this amazing teacher." And he said, "I went in his office one day, and he had all his evaluations sort of scattered over the floor." And he says, so why don't you talk about, just briefly, how you codify the comments from your evaluations, because I thought this was fascinating.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure it's that
Yeah.
brilliant. It's done
Yeah.
with pencil and paper, but you know, think of one thing: do you go too fast or too slow? You know, you're going to get people who say both. So I don't know. I just try to write down and group the comments. There's probably a dozen different things they talk about: either the homework, the case studies, the lingo. That's one. Oh, I didn't know what you meant by this or that lingo. So this time, what I'm thinking about doing from last year, you can see that's underlined kind of thick, is having the student having like a Google Doc where they go and write, here's a word I didn't understand in class today, and then either probably me, will put in a little definition, and then I can use that same doc next year.
Yeah.
That's sort of what I'm sort of thinking about doing. But as far as the codifying, I don't think I have a great secret there. It's really just a matter of truly looking over them all genuinely and objectively. It's just like getting a rejection sometimes from a report, in that some of it hurts to read, and some of it you think, what are they talking about? I wasn't doing that. I was always here. So, but trying to take the feedback as either I didn't do that well or they don't think I did that well. Either way, that's something I can work on. But this is not really related, but one thing that used to bug me was. When I'd read evaluations, does the professor care about my progress? And it's like, are you kidding me? I'm here all the time, working my butt off. Yes, I care. I do care about all their progress. So what I do now, look, I told you it's time consuming, but when the students that do poorly on the midterm, I write on their test, come to me, make an appointment, tell me what your plan is to fix this, and let's talk. I put it on them. But what I don't do is just let it disappear out the door. So I identify. Now, not all of them come to me, but if they don't, they can't point the finger at me and say, I didn't try. And the ones that do, typically they come in and they've worked at it, and I put them on the spot, basically, and kind of demand that out of them. Anyway, that's not quite a teaching evaluation, but it's a communication sort of thing.
That's great. Well, thank you. All right, so Ajay, if you I'll get your slides up. Ajay Patel, Wake Forest University. Oops. All right. Oops.
Yep. Ready to
Okay.
go.
Good. Okay.
Well, thank you, Jacqueline, for inviting me to be a part of this. When she first called me, I was going to say no, because I was wondering who is she going to be bringing on that I'm going to be on this panel with, and I'm going to look like a total fool standing up here. But she convinced me. She's really good at that. So, to be honest, I actually built this after having read John's. And so part of what I decided to do based on Jacqueline's initial suggestion was, rather than go back in and agree with everything that John said, I'm going to tell you I do agree with everything John said. But I've decided to go down maybe a little bit more into the weeds to tell you what I actually do that I think seems to work. Okay? So let me even back up even more. One of the things I know when students talk to us about, I've got these offers, where should I go? We always sit and try to tell them, think about what you care about. Think about the company. Think about the values. Try to get them to match. Well, I want each of you to think about that as well when you are choosing the type of institution you want to work for. So there are three of us here that come from three very different institutions. You've got Duke, you've got Harvard, and you've got Wake. I mean, there are some similarities, but We're very different. So think about what exactly is it that you care about? What mix of activities that we as faculty have to do turns you on, right? Then think about what exactly does that institution want and how close is that match? Now, if you're a rookie coming out, you may have limited choices, but constantly think about it, because as you progress in your career, you want to find those institutions that have that match. And if you find them, or when you find them, you're going to find you're a lot more productive, a lot of your colleagues around you care about the same thing you care about, and it'll make you happier. What ends up happening is we end up finding people like us that stay in the same institution for a long time because we found the place we're happy at. Business schools are businesses, so think about it from a business perspective. Your institution targets certain customer segments, different programs, different types. Ask yourself, what is my institution's value proposition to each of those customer segments? What is it that they have to deliver? How do they communicate with the segments? What relationship do they have to build? And once you understand that, then ask yourself, if I want to be valued in this institution, what's my value proposition to this institution? So keep that in the back of your mind as you begin to engage with the institution. Now, we're speaking specifically about teaching. So here are some of my thoughts about it, and I think John's already brought this up. Be passionate about this. Be energetic. Engage your students. Be engaging. Ask yourself, you watch presentations. Brilliant people in these conferences, and I bet you're going to walk in and walk out of some and go, that just didn't go over well, or wow, that was really good. Well, then ask yourself, what was it about that presentation that got you to say wow, or got you to say yikes? Part of it's probably going to be about, did they care? Did they prepare? How energetic were they? Did they engage? So keep that in mind. Make the content real. The students, you can push them as much as you want, but if they see the connection between what you're pushing them to do and how they're going to apply it, they will rise to the challenge. So now it's your job to figure out, how do I get them to realize what this connection is? John uses interview questions. I have different ways of doing it. You're going to need to think of what are some ways in which you can get them to realize it. Jacqueline puts videos up on YouTube. Sometimes they're videos of practitioners talking. Go listen to that and listen to how they make decisions. I use the Journal of Applied Corporate Finance a lot. Sometimes it's not to use it in class, but to read summaries of panel discussions they've had of practitioners. Go read that. He does survey work. I use a lot of his stuff. Again, to get students to realize this is how decisions are made in practice. Use that. I use news articles a lot. I have other colleagues that do it differently. I've been talking a lot about Amazon's acquisition of Whole Foods, starting from financial statement analysis and financial forecasting, right? If you happen to want to forecast, let's say, Duke Energy, can you use historical data from the last 3 or 4 years to forecast things out? And students will typically say, large, mature company utility, sounds good. And I say, okay, what about Kroger's? Well, now they realize Kroger's has just been disrupted, so they get you can't do that. Think about, well, if Duke Energy has to build a power plant, they're not going to build any nuclear, but they were thinking about it for a while. They're going to have to forecast out 30, 40 years of cash flows. How stable is Duke's business going to be 40 years from now? And then very slowly they start realizing maybe forecasting Duke's cash flows for the next 3 years is okay, but with all the disruption going on, alternative energy, electric vehicles, more energy efficient products, maybe I don't know as much as I do. So get them to think about it. I bring research into the classroom a lot. Now, I don't bring JF and JFE articles into my MSA class or my working professional class, but I do bring in pieces that he has written or other academics have written based on their JF and JFE articles that are in the Journal of Applied Corporate Finance. I don't have a textbook for the case class that I teach, so I round out the Harvard notes and Darden notes with articles that then bring current research thinking in an applied way. So think about using that creatively. I always start this elective with a roadmap. So I want them to know where we're going through the semester. And then every time we finish a segment, and I'll show you the roadmap in a minute, I help them understand this is where we've been, and this is where we're still going. And I want to keep reminding them of the reasoning behind the topics that I've pulled together, because there is no textbook. They're really a set of topics that I feel would be valuable for the students. So these aren't in equal blocks. So I only spend about 2 weeks or 2.5 weeks here. But I do start off with getting them to understand a little bit about our cognitive biases and the heuristics and how they impact decisions. Now, why should they worry about this in a corporate finance class? Well, I try to get them to understand that in corporate finance, unlike investments, some of the decisions we're going to get to are going to be driven by the CEO and the CFO and a small team of people. Well, if they've got biases, in all likelihood, it's going to factor into the decisions that they make. He's got some interesting work that he's done that I cite when I'm talking about the behavioral piece, but this is really to get him to realize that your biases are going to feed in as inputs when you start building models, and that's going to impact the output, which will then adulterate in some sense the kinds of decisions you end up making. So it's important for them to realize that piece. I also use Kahneman's article, which was an HBR, which is essentially a checklist that every person needs to have to ensure that you minimize, you can't get rid of, but minimize the impact of these biases. And I get the working professionals and the MSAs to realize how that fits in. Then we get into the tools piece. How do you value assets in place and how do you value growth options? And then I tell them, once you have the tools, now we're going to apply the tools to make decisions that create value, either through managing risk, financial policy, cash, etc. And I will do this on a regular basis through the semester. So as I told you, one of the classes that I teach a fair amount of is a case-based class. I spend a lot of time trying to figure out what specific case I want to use. And it doesn't matter to me how old it is or how new it is, it's what specific teaching objective do I want to get across. And that's the overriding decision for me. When I'm done with that case, I will tell them, this is why I chose the case. This is the teaching point that I wanted to get across. So for instance, we teach the Black-Scholes. We tell students volatility remains constant through maturity, okay? Well, then I give them a situation where they have to value a sequel, and uncertainty about the sequel in the case vanishes when the first movie is released. The sequel is not made for 3 years. So you cannot use the Black-Scholes and assume maturity is 3 because you don't have cum volatility for 3 years, it's gone at the end of 1. You can't use 1 as the maturity because maturity actually happens in 3, just the volatility vanishes. So this is literally used to force them to get that. Now I use the binomial and I show them how they can use the binomial to get it. Airthread, I teach them WACC and I teach them APV. Well, this is a mixed model based on the assumptions they make. So the students now realize I can mix models and use them, and we talk about valuing synergies. Genzyme, as opposed to a single capital structure decision, it's taking the long view. You're pre-IPO, you've been recently funded, you want to grow up and become a large integrated pharmaceutical. How should I begin to start thinking of financing my company to ultimately get there? Now, part of the focus is on one stage, but at least it's getting the students to think about the long view, which is a little different. Pacific Grove, really interesting case. Students just assume, or we maybe get across to them, that as long as you have a positive NPV project, take it because you'll always get it funded. Well, that's clearly not true. I was on the board of advisors of a private firm, 2008, liquidity shock. They were getting their lines reduced, their terms changed, without anything really fundamentally wrong with the firm. This is a great example of showing how an acquisition can both be an investment decision and a financing decision, and how some of the things that we talk about really don't apply to smaller private firms. So I talked about the online platform. So we have something called Sakai. We used to have Blackboard. All of this can be done on Blackboard as well. So all my content's up there, and I'll show you in a minute the folders that I throw up. We also have smart boards in our classes. So I actually don't even use the whiteboard. I use the smart board. I open a PowerPoint deck, have lots of slides in there, and then basically write on the smart board. save it, upload it to Sakai, so they've got their notes for every single class. They can go back and look at it anytime they want. The working professional students love it because sometimes they have to miss class, and they can go back in and actually see, not just hear. The hear part is automatically taped. I give them blanket permission to tape it. I'm not worried about people not showing up. That's really up to them. So this is a screenshot of Sakai, and you can see I got all the different folders clearly marked out. These are my class notes, syllabus is in there. I can send announcements from here, and there's the statistics button up there that I can go in and check to see who does what, how often have they looked at it, when was the last time they looked at it, so I can monitor what students are doing. You can actually have asynchronous discussions here. I haven't done that, I haven't used it, but this platform allows you to do quite a bit in staying connected with the students and making sure that it's easy for them. Engaging students, making sure they actually apply the stuff you're teaching. So, as I was saying, when I teach them financial statement analysis or ratio analysis, it's boring to sit there, here's a current ratio, divide X by Y. So what I end up doing is saying, read the stuff, we'll come to class, I'll open Morningstar up, pop up statements, I'll have one on my laptop, one on the desktop, so we got on two screens, two different firms, and I can push the data to do it in levels, to do it in percentages. And now say, okay, tell me something about this company that these percentages are telling me. So now I'm getting them to tell me a story in real time, looking at both data and percentages and or ratios, because it's already there computed for you. I use Yahoo Finance when I'm talking about capital structure. I mean, they've got data there. They've got the different components we need. I can change capital structure and try changing the WACC using different capital structures, using companies they know something about. So they all know about Duke Energy because they're all paying Duke Energy utility bills. Tiffany, a lot of them go shop at, so they know something about that. I also use the Treasury Department website, certain parts of the course. So we now have a tips curve out there. So I get them to realize what that is, and then the difference is really expectations of annual inflation, which you can now use to forecast cash flows. So now they're beginning to start seeing how they can go get data on the internet and then start applying it for people outside truly the finance group. So I get them to realize that if you want to forecast cash flows, you got to get revenue. Revenue has to come from marketing. Right? So the marketing people have to have the same expectation of inflation in their minds as the ops people do, who are going to give you the cost estimates, as the OB people are going to give you the salary numbers, and the likelihood of everybody thinking the same way is very low. So how do we get them to do that? Get data, get everybody on the same page. For class, so a couple were asking about monitoring students. I use it differently. I have colleagues that use it to assess whether or not students have actually read articles. So for class is a survey. It's Gad Allen, who moved from Northwestern to Wharton, I think set it up. The rest of his team is in Israel. I'm going to show you how I use it. But what I do is, for every case, they have to fill out the survey, I think 8 hours before class, or 10 hours, which gives me time in the morning to look at it before I actually walk in. So what do I get? This is specifically from AirThread. So one of the questions was, what methodology should you use to value the intermediate cash flows between 2008 and 2012? And we've talked to them about different models, and what you can see is they spit out for you a word map, which tells me immediately that most of them got it. A lot of them agree that the adjusted present value method is preferable to a weighted average cost of capital method. Now, if I asked you for a quantitative number, it actually plots it out and gives you a histogram for every single question that you've asked. I can pin any one of these blocks to figure out exactly who the students were that responded. So I know who's way out there, I know who's down here. I can then pin this group and then track that student's responses across the 5 or 6 questions. What this does for me is it helps me prepare, in the case discussion, who I want to ask what question to. Right? So now I know what the responses were, so if I want a debate going on, I can go to people that have responded one way, go to the other group that's responded differently, and that helps discussion. My colleagues at Wake use it for each article they may have assigned. So they give 2 or 3 questions, students have to fill them out, the student can't fill them out unless they've actually read the stuff, so the person now knows the students, the undergrads have actually read the content. I use stock price data. Again, I try flipping the classroom, so instead of going through portfolio theory and teaching them, here's how you compute a mean and here's what you do with variances, I give them the data, tell them read it, and say, now let's work through it. So we actually have them work through it, teach them how to use Solver, teach them how to use GoldSeek to actually solve these things. This gets them engaged. They now should understand what beta means, how it's computed. So when I talk about capital structure and we need to unlever beta, well, how did you compute it? Use the capital structure over the time period that you actually estimated it to unlever beta. Hopefully, it begins to stick. It's hard to tell. I use it for option pricing. So we've got the variances. Let's get implied variances or standard deviations and see the similarities in the data. This is a great one I've used for a long period of time. So before all the survey data came out, I remember sitting in a cost of capital conference. I was doing some early research on cost of capital as well, so I was interested in it. And what shocked me was having a representative from Goldman and a representative from McKinsey talk about what they use as the equity market risk premium. Goldman was using 3.5. McKinsey was using 5 or 5.5. So somebody asked, why are you using 3.5? Abby Cohen told us to use 3.5. So we all use 3.5. McKinsey, why do you use 5.5? Tom Copeland told us to use 5.5. And so you've got two of the biggest names out there, 200 basis points apart. Now, if you're 200 basis points apart in the equity risk premium, do you know how large a gap you're going to have in valuations? And so I want the students to know that the model is the science. Everything else is art. And thank God we have the art, otherwise they wouldn't need us, right? They wouldn't need them. They wouldn't need to hire them, because you could just have computers do all of this. Now we have survey data, so we want forward-looking data. Well, the Graham and Harvey survey will give you an equity risk premium on average of about 3.5%, if I'm right. Pablo's is about 5.5%. Ashwat's implied risk premium is around 5. So even if we've got forward-looking data, you still have 200 basis point difference between his survey and Pablo's. Last year, I heard Mark Zenner talk about what JP does and what he thinks are important things that people should know. He talked about the equity market risk premium and said, we use 6.5, 7. And I went, what? So I called up Ajay Khurana, who's a co-author and a good friend, who does for Citi what JP did for, what Mark Zenner did for JP Morgan. And I said, Ajay, Mark just said they use 6.5, 7. He goes, yeah, those are in the right ballpark of what we do. And I'm going, so you got investment banks using 6.5, 7. I got John's survey telling me 3.5. I can drive an airplane through anything. So I look at my students and I say, you have so much flexibility with the inputs, you can make any number look like anything. So it's not about the number, it's about justifying the assumptions. So when they have to do their cases, most of it's about, tell me what assumption you made, why did you make it, and why should I listen to you? And it's all about the assumptions. I force them to back that up. I use MidCourse evaluations. Like John, I've been teaching a little more than John. So I've been teaching maybe 35 years, and I still will do it every single class, every semester. Why? Because I want to know, where am I short? What do I need to do differently to pull this group that doesn't understand what I'm saying up? And I will then go back and tell them what I read, tell them what I heard, tell them what I will change, tell them what I won't change, and why I won't change it. And it always seems to work, in the sense my mid-course evaluations are not that good. And by the end of the course, whether it's me or them understanding me, changes dramatically and things improve a lot in terms of the evaluations. So final thoughts. Yes, John and I have told you what we do. Mihir's going to tell you what he does. Do what works for you, right? But work at it hard. It's not easy. Finance is fun. Make it fun. Get that across to them. Because if you don't believe it's fun, they're not going to believe it's fun. Engage the students. We've all heard this. I believe it's true. If you just tell them, they're going to forget it. Even if you think you're teaching them, they may remember it. Somehow involve them. And that's when they're going to actually learn. Teach. don't lecture. I think we all start off early in our careers lecturing because we've got this data dump we want to do and walk out. Figure out a way of teaching, not that. Prepare. I don't know how much is enough for you. When people ask, well, how many hours do you spend preparing? I look at them immediately and say, I'm probably an outlier. Don't worry about me. Go talk to somebody else. I probably spend over 3 hours for every class, regardless of how often I've taught it. So the cases, I go over that over and over. I don't need to go to the notes. I know the numbers. I know concepts. I've talked to myself, not loudly, but I talk to myself a lot anyway. But I've literally gone over the whole class in my head. I know what questions I want to ask. I know where I want it to end up. Now, yes, once you ask a question, the student responds, they may veer me off somewhere, but I know in the back of my mind, I got to pull this person back somehow this way because I know where I want to end up. So I don't think there's any such thing as over-preparing. Just do as much as you have to make sure that you are in control and you are the master out there in front of the classroom. Thank you.
Thank you. So those were some great, but Mihir, we're going to just have a couple of questions
sorry.
real quick.
Sorry.
Real quick. So those were some great specific tips, right, that Ajay gave us. Any questions for Ajay? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, hi Ajay. So I have some questions. I have one question about using cases, and so using cases, and so it's amazing, and so. But I want to give your advice, and so because now students, and so they can buy sort of solutions online, no matter how new the Harvard case, and so they are, and so maybe even 6 months after coming out, and so there are some websites, and so selling solutions, and so like how often do you repeat using the same case, and do you have concern and so about students and so have some access to some sort of tips, solutions, previous year's notes?
So, I mean, I do know of colleagues that are concerned about it. I really am not that concerned about it. I would be if I saw a lot of solutions that were correct, and I don't. So I'm less concerned about it. They're maybe not buying the right solutions. We have an honor code at Wake Forest, and we remind students about it. I don't change cases that frequently unless I find another case that gets the point that I want to get across, right? So I have a limited number of, one, I've never learned how to teach a case. I've never written a case. That's this master here. So I just do what I think seems to work. So no, I don't change cases constantly. I will change them. I will look for cases constantly. So I'll search Harvard's website constantly. I get emails from Harvard and Darden on new cases. I will go through them. I typically would start with the teaching note that the faculty member has written to understand what exactly is it that this faculty member wants to get across. And then I'll ask myself, is this something I want to use? Will this make a better difference in my classroom? And that's when I will pull it down and then do work on it. Some of the Harvard cases will actually give you their solution on an Excel file. I typically don't use their solution because I typically will make different assumptions. But I'll use that as a starting base and then build my whole model myself. People have run it through Turnitin. So there is software you can use. If you get the cases given to you electronically, you can actually run them through software, which will then search out on the internet for other possible solutions, and it'll tell you how much of it appears to be copied. I personally have not done it.
Yes.
So thanks for your insightful discussion. So one of our responsibilities is also grading, and so if you could share your thoughts on, especially grading on essay-based, let's say case study, business analysis kind of questions.
So it's fairly subjective. I have a rubric in my mind, I guess, if you want to call it that. When I tell students that it's not the number that matters, it's the process, it's the way you were thinking, then I literally have to follow through on that. So they send me their Excel files. If their number's wrong, I actually check every single formula to see, did they make a stupid mistake and drag a formula and it's all zeros they've added on to something? Or is it really a dumb mistake from the formula? And I grade that differently. I will grade a mistake towards the end of the class, end of the semester, differently than I would early on, because I'm expecting them to learn and I expect them to fix simple mistakes. But some of it does become subjective, because I'm trying to understand, have they thought through it correctly, and are they applying what we've been teaching them correctly? So I do hear at least one or two comments that it's too subjective. Well, what do you think the real world is? I mean, your boss doesn't give you a rubric and say, you know, here's how I'm going to grade you on the assignment you just turned in. They may as well get used to it.
You know, one thing about grading, so I don't know how many of you are grading like Excel files. That can take up a lot of time if you're grading them by hand. I know Pete does that, I do that, you do that.
It takes me over an hour per case.
Yeah, it takes a lot of time. So I'm
That's a lot of
actually
time.
now working with the guy at Georgia Tech. It's Mike Smith, and it's a guy in another department in the College of Business, and he's helping me. I know enough VBA code to be dangerous, but we're writing some VBA code to basically check all of the formulas, and basically you then get a sort of, it's codified, all the possible formulas that they've used, and you can check, you know, if the number's right, it's probably right, because they could have written the formula differently, right? They could have written it differently and it'd still be right. They may have done it out of order, so then you can feed back all of the possible correct solutions, and then it'll just kick out the ones that you need to check, you know, a little bit more. And it reduces grading time by a lot.
Where would you buy this solution?
Well, yeah, so he's actually got it for some of his classes. He's already doing it. And he's helping me right now write mine. And so I'll be happy to share it, you know. Because you're right, it could take easily an hour to grade one Excel file. And so things like that are, you know, because is that really the best use of your time, right? Right. Whereas you still need to grade it, but then maybe you could have some mechanized procedure to help you along. Yeah. So, all right. And Mihir.
Thank
All right,
you.
let me get your slides.
Sure.
This is Mihir Dasai from Harvard. And you know, Mihir, they put us in the Harvard room.
Yeah, I requested that. So I just want to start by saying I apologize for coming in late. That's about as low class a thing as you can do. But the alternative was to cancel a class to come here to talk about teaching. The irony of which was just too much to bear. So I thought I would just talk a little bit. I know I've seen John and Ajay's slides, and they're very thorough, and they seem to capture most of the relevant advice. So I'm just going to give you a couple of alternative approaches and some alternative thoughts, and then I'd be delighted to answer your questions. I might just start, by addressing some of those questions that have already come up. So I'll give you some quick overall thoughts. I think most of you are going to be interested in talking about cases. I'll give you some thoughts about cases. I've had recently these two other experiences that I think are versions of case experiences. They're alternative things. There's an online course and there's a book. And so I thought I would just share that. Inevitably it's going to sound like I'm selling something, I'm not selling anything. But I think it's something that is really fun to do, like an online course. And I imagine some of you have thought about doing that. So I thought I would share a little bit of the experience of that. Okay, so I thought I would just try to boil it down to the most important thoughts, because I think it's important to keep things simple. And I think the most important thing, and this goes to kind of teach, don't lecture, that you guys have both said, I'll just say it in just a different way, which is it's not about you, which is like the hardest lesson in life, which is often you think it's about you and it's not about you. And I think the thing that people do when they teach is they think it's about them, and it's about you demonstrating knowledge. It's like that's not what the idea is, and especially when you're young, you think it's about you demonstrating knowledge. That's what seminars may be for. Like, seminars aren't even for that. Seminars are for, but this is not a show about you, it is about them. That's very confusing, I think, and it's easy to get confused. You're not trying to prove something to them, you have to put yourself in their shoes. That goes to number 3, which is, fundamentally it is about sitting in someone else's shoes. The hardest thing to do is, this material is relatively speaking very easy for you. It's hard to imagine how hard it is for them. And that is the act of empathy that you are required to do. And it is really, really hard. I mean, I'm sure, I don't know if you guys have had this experience, but I often instruct, you get a second year student and they do things wrong that you thought they would have gotten in the first year. And one possibility is you can blame it on the colleague who taught the first year course, which is a fun game, but it's not true. It's just this stuff is hard. And so you got to acknowledge that and think that through. And so I think that is a really important piece of the puzzle, is to constantly think about what there is in their shoes. And then the second point I just wanted to make is, I think is just really, really important, which is less is more, which is the point that we tend to cram things in. And part of the reason we cram things in is because we like all the ideas and we want them to know all the ideas. But the reality is, first, more is less, which is if you cram a lot of things in, they don't get it. And it's not about the amount you cram in, it's about the amount they absorb. And so sometimes less is more. And so that means sometimes, that some of the fine points that we might really, really enjoy, like, I don't know, getting the tax effects and the levering betas or whatever example you want to pull up in your mind is important, but the big ideas are the things we should be spending most of our time on. So that's a way of saying, try to get the big ideas across. I think if you win there, you've succeeded in a large way, and that is the most important thing you can do. And then the final thing is, I like to say that people find finance very, very intimidating. And there's a reason for it, which is people in finance like to intimidate people. And so you have to counter that and be the alternative force, which is a way of saying you have to acknowledge that other people make it intimidating, and you have to make it clear that that's not what you're going to do. And again, I think you'd be surprised by how intimidating people find it, both because of the numeracy, which a lot of people are scared of, and then on top of it, there's the machismo, which finance cloaks itself in. And that combination is pretty lethal for people. So that even if they want to learn, they're blocked. And so fundamentally, you have to think about diffusing that intimidation. That's the first thing you should try to do, through humor or whatever it is you can do. If you add to it, it's a disaster for yourself and for them. All right, so those are just some big overall thoughts that I think are just meant as compliments to all the stuff that Ajay and John already mentioned. We can talk about writing cases, or we can talk about teaching cases. I just have, and I guess I kept this short because I think if it gets long, it's too complicated. So let me start with number 2. So I think, the key thing to realize when you teach a case is, what does a teaching plan look like? And if your teaching plan looks like a lot of things that you're going to say, then you have a problem. The teaching plan should really, and this is like a purist, obviously it won't look like this completely, but it really should be a set of questions. That's it. That's all that it should be. And so what do I mean by that? So maybe that sounds easy, which is, you just got to ask questions. And the answer is not exactly. You have to work backwards into the questions, right? So you have to think about the teaching points, then you have to think about the ideas, you have to think about the case, and then you work backwards to what are the questions you ask to get them to do it themselves. So all the time preparing, I think it's not, as you pointed out, you remember the numbers, you know the numbers, that's not the preparation, although it can be the first time through or second time through. It's just getting the questions right. And I think you've all had this experience. I happen to have just had it like an hour ago, where you ask a question that is not helpful. It's like an unconstructive question. It's like a total flat question. So not all questions are good questions. You have to kind of sculpt the question. And that, I think, is most what you should spend your time doing when you prepare. It's all about coming in with 10 questions, which is your roadmap for the class. That's, I think, what it's all about. I think the second thing that's really hard about teaching cases is it's fundamentally an act of trust. You're in their hands, and that's like to some degree, that's like a vulnerability because you're going to go where they're going to go, and that's hard. And the point is, it's going to be okay. Let them go where they want to go. You're still in control. Get it back to where you want it to go ultimately, but don't run roughshod over them. You've got to trust them that they'll get to the point where they need to get to. There will be occasions where they go random on you, and they go way off in this direction, and that's possible, but the truth is they almost always come back, and they almost come back to what you want them to come back to. So let me put it in a more negative way. The negative thing to do is, to not let silences percolate. The hardest thing when you start is you ask a question and you have to wait. And you have to wait a long time. The insecurity will make you say, let me tell you what's going on. And that's wrong. And similarly, when somebody goes in this direction, the instinct is, well, we're not talking about that now. We're talking about, let's get back to this. Both of which just kill case discussions. So you have, and the antidote to that is just believe believe that they will get there, and believe that the question you asked is the right question. It may go like this, but it'll get there. So I think is a really important piece of intuition. And then this final piece is, and I'm happy to think about other things as well, which is that this final piece is, I think, something that I find very helpful to think about in my head. The mistake we make with cases when we write them and when we teach them, and certainly when we write them, is they either work at 30,000 feet or they work at 10 feet. If you're just doing one of those two things, that's not enough. So what does that mean? So 30,000 feet is very high up in the sky, and 10 feet is very close to the ground, obviously. So what does that mean? A 30,000 foot discussion is, tell me what the nature of the business Apple's in, what does their financial policy look like, in general, how do you think about this? And people love to talk about that stuff. What is the right strategy, and blah, 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 blah. And you can have a discussion that's very rich. And what is a 10-foot discussion? A 10-foot discussion is, well, wait a second, how do I think about the right number to put in here, and how do I think about precisely what is happening, and why did you use that assumption, and let's get the numbers right. The mistake we make, and many cases, are either of those two things, and that is unsatisfying, because the magic is in the integration of those two things, right? So, in my, I'll give you an example of something recent, which is, this just happens to be fresh in my mind. So recently I taught this case about On High and Sharp. On High invests in Sharp, and Terry Guo put some money into a Sharp display. Okay, so there's like a valuation piece to it, and there's like a spreadsheet, and there are numbers, and you have to get the numbers right, and there's something about some costs, and you have to do the numbers, and you got to get it right. And then you got to telescope up, or whatever it is, lift up, and talk about the governance implications of why Guo structured it the way he did. You got to have both of those. And if you have them doing one of them, it's not really working. So I think the tendency is for people to use cases to do the 10-foot thing, which is, here's an exercise in numbers, but I've put it in the context of a case. I think that's not that helpful to them, and it doesn't use the case method for what it's worth. Similarly, if you're just using it to talk at some high level about issues, that happens less in finance, but it happens in a lot of other domains. You spend a lot of time just talking at 30,000 feet. The idea here is the 10-foot thing has got to reinforce the 30,000 foot point. And so if they're not reinforcing each other, meaning the 30,000 foot point is making you realize why doing the 10-foot thing is important, and the 10-foot thing is illuminating the 30,000 foot point. If you're doing only one of those things in a case, it's a problem. And by the way, it's easy to only do one. Because students love chit-chatting. And so they're happy to stay at 30,000 feet, and they also love, once they're in the weeds, they love staying in the weeds. They want to get to the 5th decimal point. So neither of those is a satisfactory outcome. I'm happy to talk a lot more about cases, about writing cases or teaching cases or whatever you'd like. I'm just going to share this quick thoughts about alternative approaches in case they're of interest to you. So I recently had this experience with an online course, which has been, and this is just meant to suggest to you, if you've thought about doing this, you should do it. It's like fantastically rewarding. So the reason why is there's like a big world out there. It's of course not news to you, but you'll appreciate it more if you do something like this. It's just very rewarding to try to access people who are not in your classrooms physically. So if you have an opportunity to do something or you're creating material, it's like a great experience. And so I just really would encourage you to do that. Very counterintuitively, it requires more, not less interaction, and more, not less cases. So that's counterintuitive because you think, well, it's online and it's distance, so why would you need that? And the point is exactly that, it's online, so your ability to keep their attention is lower, so you have to make it more interactive and you have to make it more compelling. So it's harder in that sense, because when you're in a room, first off, you can police them, they have to be in the room. You can ask them questions because they're there, and you can do all kinds of things to them. In an online setting, you just can't do any of those things. So the logic has to be, well, I have to work harder to stop and make them do an exercise, and stop and make them do an exercise, and make them click through only when they've done things. That's the really, I guess, counterintuitive piece of the online realm, which is you have to do things even more interactively than you do in a classroom. And cases similarly. These people are less likely to be tolerant of theory because they tend to be out in the wide world, so they really want real-world applications. And then the final thing to say is, this is a little bit in the weeds, but the platform is everything. So that's just, I say that in part because everybody who does digital stuff says that, so I think I'm just supposed to say that, platform. But it turns out to be true, which is if you're operating on a platform that has a lot of capabilities for social things or for other things, that is fantastic. So you have to pick a platform or go with a platform or find a platform or build a platform that allows you to do things. If your idea is like slapping it on a video online, that day is gone, I think, and if it ever existed. And so it's really got to be a platform that allows you to do different things, and that turns out to be really important. My final thought about alternative thoughts is this book I wrote recently, and I guess, again, this is very pedagogic in its aim, which is, I think the way to teach something is to come at it from many different directions. So that's just a way of saying, there's a phenomenon here like capital structure, and you can teach it by using a case. You can teach it by using a graph of a trade-off theory. You can teach it by illustrating it via equations. And you can illustrate it by talking about leverage in a very general way in your life. And I think that last piece is something we do very, very little, which is we don't map the ideas of finance to people's lives. And because it's so intimidating, it's all the more important to do that, because they don't understand the idea unless they think about it. So what I did in this lecture that became a book is just do that. I just took all the big ideas of finance and I just tried to map them to ways to think about your life. And people like us already do some of that, so like optionality. Optionality is something that we might pursue in our lives, right? It's not just optionality in the sense of an option, financial option, it's a concept in your mind. I need to get leverage. I need some leverage. Online courses provide leverage. So you have to use those words in ways that are different than the way that you're using them when you're teaching capital structure, because then it makes them think in a different way. The leverage line, of course, is from a lever, and the Archimedes line, give me a lever and a place to stand and I'll move the world. I've often done this in class. So, wait a second, what's magical about a lever? You get to move rocks you have no right to move, right? That's why, because it magnifies force. Well, what's the rock in finance? What's the lever? Who's pushing down? Equity wants to control more assets than they have any right to control. The lever is the thing that allows them to do that, and just make them think in a different way. And so stories turn out to be actually really, really fun ways to do that. Leverage maps to commitments, mergers maps to marriages, optionality maps to ways you think about education and a lot of other things. The CAP-M can relate to friendships and relationships. There's like a rich mapping, in part because the ideas of finance are like fantastic. And they don't just occupy the domain of finance. They occupy a lot of our lives. And so that's another way to teach. All right, good. I should keep track of the time, but I'm happy to take questions.
You're good. So we have time for questions, so please, if you've got questions about cases, here's the master, so Pete.
I just have a question for you, but also for if I could, for the other two speakers.
Sure.
Those people that know me know that I am incredibly thick at picking up signals that other people are giving. So very often I find myself thinking, I really nailed this concept, only to find out that the students didn't understand it at all. So how do you three check on your students' understanding to make sure that they're actually getting what you're saying? What sort of techniques or approaches do you use?
I'll get started. I mean, the most obvious way is to cold call and to probe them. The problem with doing that is it's intrusive and intimidating to people. So you have to do it in a very nice way. You have to say, John, maybe you can help us think about this. And we just talked about this. How can you do this for us? And if John stumbles, you say, I know it's a really hard idea, but let's just try it together. We'll do it together. And then you help John muddle through it. So that's the most obvious way. And then the second most obvious way is just by visual inspection, which is, if laptops are open and there's a lot of typing going on when there shouldn't be typing going on, if there are people getting up and moving around a lot, all of those are signs that they're not engaged. Those are just That's fundamentally what they're saying. And so those visual cues are the other way to kind of do it.
So some of my colleagues do the following. I haven't started doing it yet, but you can actually put little, polls that you put out. You just teach a concept, and it's like a little quiz they put into their phone, and you can see the
Socratic.
histogram,
Socratic
whether they get it
is-
right or wrong. That gives you pretty quick feedback. Again, I haven't actually tried that, but I'll just repeat briefly this thing I called the review game, where I'll teach the idea, then we'll take a break, and we'll come back, and I'll put, at first I did it, I'd put an individual on the spot, and you could see the look of terror come on that person's face. So that's why I started doing this thing about you four, and then they talk, and then they have to repeat the idea back. And it's kind of sort of what Mihir just said, but so I've thought through what I want to do to get them to repeat it back, because if they don't get it, you right then know, okay, I better go back over this. It doesn't mean repeat what you just said earlier really fast, because probably that didn't work. You have to think creatively of a new way to get at it. But you get that feedback in the middle of class instead of on the midterm when you see, oh, everybody got number 2 wrong. I guess that didn't connect.
Ajay?
So, I do cold call, but it's how you ask the question after they've responded. So if I ask a question, they go, no clue. I said, nah, let's think through this. Right? So I try to give them an opportunity, but if they're struggling, I don't want to, so then I go to the next person and move on. I have used quizzes. I do them infrequently, but I would do that in the corporate finance, the first class, where you're building on concepts. And so you'd give them a quiz for 5-10 minutes at the beginning of class, and they begin to start realizing either they get it or they haven't gotten it, and you now know about it as well. So then I would probably, after the second or third quiz, knowing the same person has had a problem, I'll shoot them an email and say, why don't you come by and see me if they haven't seen me. I have colleagues at Wake Forest, and I don't know about in the school business, that use clickers or quizzes that the students can respond on their iPads or phones or whatever, and in real time you can actually see responses come up. The 4-class thing that I was talking about, you could assign 2 or 3 questions on particular concepts that you want to make sure they've learned. Have them fill it out overnight, and before you show up to class the next day, you know how many of them got it right and how many of them got it wrong. You'll know exactly who got it right and who got it wrong. So I think there are different ways in which you can do it. But you're right. It is hard sometimes to pick up on whether or not they've got it, because a lot of the time I'll see them doing this, and I know they have no clue what I'm talking about. And midterm, they'll say he had no idea. We had no idea what he's talking about. And I'd go and say, oh, I know you had no idea what I'm talking about. It's your job to stop me at some point and go, please explain this, because you go off and work and somebody starts using language and you have no idea what it is, and you don't ask them a question, they're going to assume you knew what they were talking about. So I think some of the onus should be on them as well to stop you. But I think Mihir's right. You got to be really careful, and John too, on how you ask them, because they are intimidated. Now, in my elective, I'm less concerned because this is self-selection. This is not the first finance class, so I guess I'm less concerned about beating up on them. But in the first course where everybody has to take it, I'm a little more careful in how I test them.
So we've got a few more minutes. I wanted to open it up to the floor to, so many of you probably, particularly if you're new in the profession, the class that you have to teach is an intro finance class, right? How many people have ever had to teach an intro finance class, right? So you've got to undergraduates, and maybe to MBA students too, you've got a range of knowledge. You've got marketing majors, you've got IT majors, you've got finance majors, you've got accounting majors. And often, the non-finance majors are already scared of the class, right? They're scared. So I'll just start with an example, and then I want somebody to give me another example so we can share it with the room. So I recently, at Georgia Tech, I noticed that the students were having difficulty. This is, again, to your point, to somebody's point, right? This is all easy to us. It's hard for us to imagine it's difficult for them. So I had several students not understanding how to move cash flows up and down the timeline, right? I'm at 4, I'm at year 4, how do I get it to year 2? Just that concept, right? It's easier to go from 4 to 0, but now to go from 4 to 2 or 2 to 8, now you're further out on the timeline, and that's just confusing, right? So after the first test, I had any student that made below the class average, they had to come see me. They had to come see me. And then I looked to see what they did, were they involved in sports. I wanted to figure out who they were when they came to see me. So I had a football player, one of the football players, he came in my class, or he came to my office, and he could not get the moving up and down the timeline. So he was a defensive player. So I said, you're on the 4-yard line, and you're moving that guy to the 2-yard line. That click. It clicked. He's got it, and he's probably going to make 100 on the next test. That's all he needed was, something that related to him. So I'm opening the floor to somebody. Give me an example and share with everybody how you made it click for somebody. Anybody want to share? Come on. Yes, John?
It's not really fair because it wasn't me. I flipped, and so that means I put my students into groups in a giant classroom, groups of 5, and that means they're friends, so all have different examples that they provide, and I go around the room making sure I can see who's leading the group, and when they say, okay, we're done, and I say, hang on a second, did everybody in this group really get it? It's your job to make sure that they all get it. So I always put the onus back on the groups.
And you're doing that in class?
Yeah.
In class.
So all lectures are recorded, they consume them before they come to class. All class time is spent on an activity. Every class period has an activity, application, real data.
So how long did it take you to get all of the content online? Just for
It's
people who
11
don't-
hours worth of content, and I spent my summer putting together the recordings, the in-class activities, the quizzes, the homework problems, everything.
And can you tell the difference in learning outcomes?
100%, 200%, 300% better.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's hard. I'm happy to share.
Okay. Anyone else? Mom, we've got some people who've taught for a long time. I'm gonna start cold calling you if you don't volunteer. Pete, what do you do?
Well, I also flip the class, and then part of the thing that I've done is to me, I read something a while ago. It's Joe Ben Hoyle teaches at Richmond. And he said that most of success in teaching is getting students to come to class prepared. So what I've done is spent a lot more of my time trying to design mechanisms so that they actually have watched the video, and then they get questions on the videos before class, and then I use clickers or Socrative to assess them very quickly at the beginning of class. And what I found by doing that, it gave me so much time that in the intro class, I can spend in a 50-minute class, 25 to 30 minutes working problems, which is what they needed. But it's figuring out ways to get them, because if they come to class prepared, it's hard to mess them up. And if they don't come to class prepared, it's hard to help them.
So in your videos, do you have questions? In order to get along in the video, do they have to do something?
I haven't done it in the videos, but for each video, they're given a video and 3 to 5 things in that 5 to 10 minute video that they must be able to do when they're done. So I'll give them practice problems afterwards or questions to answer. And I call the questions that I ask them at the beginning of class. They know they're going to have a quiz, but they're mirror fogging questions. In other words, if they watch the video and I held a mirror under their nose, if there was fog on the mirror, they should be able to get it right. So real simple questions. It's so basic that if they have to be such that if they've watched the video, they ought to be able to get 4 out of the 5 questions right.
Anybody else want to share?
I was just going to address
Yeah.
that heterogeneity point, because I
Yes.
think it's a really important point about finance classes. I don't know how you guys deal with it, but I think it's one of the hardest things, which is there are